And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Seth Stern is the author of Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, Survivors on South Jersey Poultry Farms. He is a legal journalist and editor at Bloomberg Industry Group. Sandra Fox is the author of The Jews of Summer, Summer Camp and Jewish Culture in Post-War America. She is a visiting assistant professor of Hebrew Judaic Studies at New York University and director of the Archive of the American Jewish Left in the Digital Age. Sarah Maslin Nir is a staff reporter for the New York Times, a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and author of the Once Upon a Horse series of children's books, featuring true stories from across the equestrian world. Thank you all for joining us, and now I'll hand it over to our speakers.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see a packed crowd at a Jewish book festival. It's inspiring and empowering for us writers of Jewish stories. My children's series was mentioned by our kind introduction, but I actually wrote a book called Horse Crazy, The Story of a Woman and a World in Love with an Animal, which is a reported look at the obsession with horses. And one of the feedback comments I get all the time is, why is there so much Hitler in this book about horses? And that's because, braided together are the stories of being a Holocaust survivor's daughter, child, descendant, as all of us are necessarily writ large. Those are our stories. And when I got the titles for these books, I just said this to the authors, I was like, what am I reading about? Chickens and summer camp? And then why is there so much Hitler in these books about chickens and summer camp? Because that is the story, and these are not stories about chickens or camping. These are stories about Jewish experience in rising from the ashes of trauma. I encourage you to get these books after they surprised and illuminated and excited me. They are also deeply researched by a pair of truly expert researchers. I never thought I would say this, but in this book about chickens, there's an appendix. How many pages long is your?
Quite a few.
Yeah, it's like a 75-page appendix, and nothing about chickens. But I wanted to talk to each of you. You, very specifically, Seth, these come from personal stories. That's the launching point. And can you talk to us about the personal impetus for this story, and then maybe a little bit about the cover stars?
Sure. So the story here is how did roughly 1,000 Holocaust survivors wind up as poultry farmers in southern New Jersey? And it is a personal story for me. It is the story of my grandparents and my mother, who's in the front row. So pictured here is the farm that she shared with another family. And the little girl who she lived on the farm and was essentially raised as a twin for a number of years is also here in the front row. So it's both a deeply personal book, but I tried to tell the broader story of how these survivors wound up as farmers and where they fit in the larger story of American Jewish agriculture.
Seth, can I ask you, when did you first realize this story was important?
I started interviewing my grandmother in 1998. So it goes back a long time, and I think initially I, just like many grandchildren of survivors, thought I would try to preserve the story for our own family. As time went on and I continued to interview my grandmother, I thought that this piece of it, the farmer, is a story. There are a lot of stories about books about survivors, but not much is known about this particular avenue of settlement, and so I thought this would be a great story to tell, and off and on over the next quarter century I worked on it, and it was published last year.
And Sandra, the same for you. The origin story of this book, you very clearly said that you're not a Holocaust researcher, but somehow this book became that story as well.
Yeah, so the origin story for this book is kind of funny because I did go to a Jewish summer camp, much like a lot of the camps in this book, but I went at a very different time. So I was born in 1988, went to camp in the late 90s and the 2000s. And so for me, actually, as an academic historian, I was worried that I was too connected to the story of Jewish summer camping, and found that with that generational distance, it was very possible for me to do the research and to see kind of where my camping experience actually came from, even though it was quite different. It's funny because like thinking about the pictures of the kids on the cover, or of Seth's cover, I really wanted an image that reflected the themes of the book. So like something about something with Jewish campers doing something really obviously Jewish, but the press really wanted this image, something that was marketable. They thought it was more marketable and that it would look good as a like a thumbnail on Amazon, which was annoying. But then I kind of came around to it because I was like, wait, actually this book is sort of about these American kids having a very normal summer camping experience on the kind of outside, but actually the inside of the daily schedules and activities was so intense, and in large part that's because I studied the period right after the Holocaust. And so
one thing that became very clear to me when I read both of these books is that they're not trivial subjects, and you might think it chickens and camping, right? It's easy, but they are quite deep and about identity. And when did you realize this book was larger, or this story was important enough to tell?
I always knew it was important to tell because my experience going to camp and seeing other people go to camp, and just I knew the content of what I did at camp was deeply serious, like bizarrely serious. It was not really purely recreational, but sometimes convincing other people that it was serious was challenging. And I do think like even as the book has come out, it sometimes comes off to people like it's going to be a fun read about summer camp, and there are fun parts, but it is deeply serious because in the post-World War II period, American Jews of all different kinds of ideological stripes really came to see summer camps as places where they could turn the next generation into real or authentic Jews. That like something about post-war suburbia was not going to do that, and taking them away from their parents and away from the suburbs was the way that you were going to do that, by making like every single hour of the day speak to some sort of Jewish ideology. So I knew it was deeply serious from the start, and I think it's been my job over the years to kind of show people how serious it is, and I think it succeeded over time.
One of the things my father, who was a Holocaust survivor, used to say, that assimilation is a type of annihilation. That's sort of becoming just like any other person, not wearing your Jewish identity proudly. He was a very caustic kind of guy. But he said doing the Nazis' work for them. And I always thought that was an interesting concept. Can you talk, Seth, about ways in which the Jews in South Jersey assimilated and also kept their identity? And then I think that's really a question for you as well, Sandra, because this summer camp experience was all about not losing your Jewishness post-war.
Well, I think they both tried to keep a foot in the prior world and in the new world. So the survivors, they kept to themselves, and we could talk about whether they didn't feel welcomed by American Jews. They had their own, it was called the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, and they would have cultural events, and they would invite Yiddish performers and poets and comedians and singers would perform there, and they identified very strongly with Zionism and agriculture, which was interesting in reading Sandy's book, about how it was very much different lanes, that you had the Zionist camps and the Yiddish camps, and yet these survivor farmers, who many of them spoke Yiddish and at home and amongst each other, they still identified with that, and yet they also identified as Zionists and with Israel. But they also wanted their children to become American, and so I write in the book about how they made sure their kids joined Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and Little League and all the other things that other American kids did, and the cowboy era, and there were horse shows and a local rodeo every Memorial Day weekend, and so it very much was a foot in both worlds, and very different from the typical survivors' children in New York, how they were navigating both being American and survivors. It was very much had a rural flavor to it.
I think that in the case of summer camp, the 4 to 8 week sleepaway camp experience is so inherently American. It really doesn't exist anywhere but here or Canada. There were summer camps in Eastern Europe that Jews went to, but they'd be like a weekend or a week. And even today in Israel, summer camp is about a week long at maximum. So there is something really inherently American about it. But instead of Native American imagery that you see at a lot of summer camps that are not necessarily Jewish, or some camps that are Jewish, owned by Jewish families and predominantly attended by Jewish campers, but not necessarily Jewish in content. Instead of that Native American imagery, you have Jewish imagery. And so at the Zionist camps I studied, you would kind of replace all of that imagery with things that were coming from Palestine and later Israel. In the Yiddish summer camps, it would harken back to a Yiddish-speaking past in Eastern Europe. And so it's actually, in a way, de-assimilating the American summer camp experience by making it fit these different Jewish ideologies. And I think the image in my book that captures this the most is a really great image from Camp Masad, which was a kind of Hebrew immersive summer camp. They aimed to really get the kids to speak Hebrew all the time. It didn't really work, but that was the goal. And they had a baseball diamond where behind the, is that the batter's plate? What do you call it? I'm just realizing the first home plate. Thank you. I don't know anything about sports. Behind the home plate, there was a huge kind of like wooden sign with all of the terms for baseball terms in Hebrew. But of course, they made those up because no one was playing, or almost no one was probably playing baseball in Israel in like 1956. So I think that's like a perfect illustration of that tension of, on the one hand, these are so American. On the other hand, they're trying to Judaicize or Hebraicize or Yiddishize this American experience to make these essentially very assimilated American kids who were, for the most part, all born in America, almost entirely, into better or more real Jews.
The baseball diamond, baseball home plate, whatever we said it was, reminds me, if anyone's been to the Eldridge Street Synagogue, it's a really extraordinary sort of preserved moment in Jewish time in New York. And in the section of benefactors, they have all the names, written on the wall of the big machers who could give, money to the synagogue. And it says men's section and women's section, but it's in Yiddish letters, but it doesn't say the word for woman in Yiddish. It says women's section, and so it's that kind of tension of being, we're American now, but still using our language. One thing that really interested me on this topic from your book were the games, Aliyah Bet, and I can't pronounce the other, yeah, you can do it. Yeah, can you talk about that? I mean, that to me is rather than play dodgeball, they're playing games that inculcate, different sort of ideologies and Jewish self-mythologies. Can you talk about that?
Right. So I guess one overarching theme in the book is that these summer camps, which are really, I studied the most intensively Jewish summer camps, where Judaism or Jewish ideologies shaped every single hour of the day. They were in their own ways role plays of other times and places in Jewish history, or in the Jewish present in the case of Zionist camps. They also, within that framework of a really busy day of different kinds of activities, often had role-playing games or something that people called sociodramas, where campers would be put on different sides of a kind of historical situation, and they would role play or simulate that moment in history. So what you're referencing is in a lot of the Zionist camps, they would do a game of what illegal immigration, Jewish immigration to Palestine was during the British Mandate, in order to understand that experience. Or they would...
It's like cops and robbers, but the bad guys are Arabs and the British, and the good guys are the Jews.
And usually the campers all get to be the Jews in this case, so counselors will play the other roles, because the idea is to only empathize or kind of learn the experience of the Jews in these stories, right? So these are really direct role plays of what these camps are presenting to the campers as these better, authentic, more real Jewish stories. Like they need to act these out in order to become real Jews, because their experience in America could never possibly do that. That's the idea.
And it's a little bit like the admonition during Pesach to say we were in Israel, not they, so to be the character.
And some camps also did kinds of role plays of Holocaust situations. that's things I've heard from alumni. I've never seen anything in archives about it, and because I'm a kind of academic historian, I was loath to write about anything that like I couldn't find archival evidence for. But I know that this is a thing that's happened, and it's also happened in more recent decades. So there are campers, former campers in their 30s and 40s who remember acting out Holocaust, like simulations of the Holocaust, which is very intense. And I don't think camps would do it now because they'd probably get sued by parents for traumatizing their kids.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Yeah. We did apartheid. We did apartheid when I was a kid. A bunch of us were assigned to be white and a bunch of us were assigned to be black, and we spent the whole day doing apartheid, which I can't imagine that happening now, but it was, I learned the lesson of how wrong that was. It was an intense day. But I wanted to talk, you actually led me to the next question, but I want to talk about trauma. My father was a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorder. He spoke 7 languages, so he actually treated the very insular Hasidic community in Yiddish and Ukrainian and Polish and Russian and German. And was one of the few people who was allowed to treat them, but they were really riddled with trauma post-war. And your book has just, agonizing trauma. The characters, you have people who survived almost every camp there is, partisans. The women, the strength of the women in your book is astounding. Can you pull out a particular thread and how that trauma and recovery or not recovery played out on these poultry farms?
Well, I think what's important to recognize, and I try to make this point in the book in many respects, that the survivors weren't a monolith, and so they don't all fall in a story of triumph and overcoming overcoming trauma. They don't all fall into just not being able to move beyond it, and the same holds true for how religiously observant they were after the war, how well they did, how much success they had. But in terms of trauma, it's unbelievable. Every form that you could imagine from the war, and there were only so many ways to survive the war. You survived in a camp, you survived in hiding like my grandparents. They lived for more than a year and a half in an underground dugout in a forest as partisans, or you survived by passing as a non-Jew. Or you had fled to the Soviet Union at some point. So, but each of those brought with it its own horrible experiences, and they all experienced that, and the extent to which they wanted to talk about it was something else that ranged tremendously. Some of them, like my grandmother, had no interest in talking about it, and others talked about it to excess, and their kids suffered for it. But there were so many. What's interesting about the community of survivors that I write about, there were so many of them in a small community, and you could only really compare it to a handful of neighborhoods in New York City at the time, that they could segment, that you could play, they would socialize playing poker or other card games, and you could segment your card game. You'd talk Yiddish, Hungarian, and you could also gravitate to other women or farming men who wanted to talk about it. So in your card game, yeah, you might talk about it a lot. In another card game that they were not. So that's just how many survivors were in this community that you could have that kind of shared experience in a granular level.
I want to talk about women in your book. They are incredibly strong. Branya, many others. There are multiple women who had to give up babies because the noise that the babies made would have had them discovered when they were in hiding. Right? One woman, the group of Jews she was hiding with, baby started to cry out, and they wanted to smother the baby, but the woman said she would scream and tell everyone's location if they did that. But she ultimately did give up the baby to a Polish family. Can we talk about the resilience of women, and maybe you can tell some of their stories that really affected you?
Extraordinary resilience, as you say. In the case of my grandmother, the family notion was that my grandfather was the strong one, and if not for him, that my grandmother wouldn't have survived the war. And that's probably true, but he died at 72. My grandmother lived to 96, so she was strong in her own right. The women, more than one woman, had to give up their child. Some of them, trying to reunite after the war. The child didn't recognize them, didn't want to go back with them. It was a lengthy process of reuniting. You can imagine how painful it is. Your own child is essentially rejecting you. The story you recounted in the forest, this is the dugout where my grandmother was with another woman who gave birth. Unimaginable how you would give birth in a dugout. There's no medical supplies. The baby survives, and then because of and this is near the end of the war, the very end of the war, that they had to leave the baby behind. And it's not, as you say, I mean, it's not supported by archival history, but this is what they recounted, and they had to leave the baby behind. And she was I'm not good with the microphone. She was so ashamed that she never told her daughter. And my grandmother, I think, was the one who told the daughter that this had happened when my grandmother was in her 80s, because it was such a source of shame for the mother to have had to have abandoned her child like that.
And how did that resilience play out in America in their new lives?
You see that just the idea of starting over on a farm. Almost none of these people had any farming experience. So you come to America, which in itself is starting over. You come with no money. You come with no family. Almost all of these people had lost everyone. They had an uncle or an aunt somewhere in the U.S. who might have sponsored them. They had maybe an expectation they would settle in a city, and that didn't work out. There was a post-war housing shortage. The demobilization of the military meant there weren't a lot of jobs for new immigrants who had their high school or college educations interrupted by the war. They didn't know English, and that's the idea in the book title. Speaking Yiddish to Chickens is how many of the survivors in these oral history interviews would joke, well, the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish. But it was true. They didn't. Part of the appeal was they didn't know English, and this was a job they could do. They could be their own boss, and they didn't need to know English. But it was extraordinarily hard work, dirty, difficult work every day. You couldn't take time off. It proved to be a terrible business because just the nature of agriculture. And yet they threw themselves at it. They created new community. And many of them, almost all of them, they had to start over again because farming failed. And that meant in the 60s, whether it was in South Jersey or going elsewhere, in the case of my family back to Brooklyn or elsewhere, and starting out once again. So it was just over and over again having to reinvent themselves on top of all of the trauma they'd experienced.
I want to talk about women in your book as well, young women, and you have a whole section on camper sexuality, which is not something I thought I would read, but there was a real idea of this being a bulwark against intermarriage and a type of really interesting permissiveness allowed in those camps, maybe with a bit of an agenda that the campers weren't aware of. Can you talk about that? And
yeah, I think that what I show is that camps were relatively permissive even before interfaith marriage became a huge focal point of the American Jewish establishment's kind of goals, curbing intermarriage. But the rates of intermarriage rose after the sexual revolution. So at a moment where camps could have gotten more concerned about what campers were actually doing, because in the 40s and 50s, even the kind of early 60s, the idea was like, you can let them kind of be with, let boys and girls do whatever they want because they're probably not having sex. But after the sexual revolution, there was more concerns that they would go past a certain point of no return, I guess. So, but it's at that moment that rates of intermarriage are starting to rise, and American Jews are starting to take notice of this. There's, news articles about it, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger concern. And so this already permissive culture, which could have become less permissive, remains very permissive in kind of the post-sexual revolution moment, because camp leaders realize and talk about it very explicitly that if campers see camps as places where they can have freedom, including sexual freedom, they will, first of all, kind of take on the ideologies of their camps more willingly, because they'll see it as a free will choice. But also they will take the sort of these habits or ideas around Jewish dating into their adult lives. Also, people got married younger, so they might actually meet their spouses at camp. And so that began kind of a longer history of camps being pretty permissive in terms of romance and sexuality. And by permissive, I don't just mean like looking the other way, but actually creating times in the schedule, right? The end of the last activity of the day. Why is there a 30 to 45-minute gap between that and when the campers need to be in the bunk?
Kissing.
Right, which is, lovely. But like that is what it was for. And so it was really interesting to find examples of that in the archive. And of course, I also spoke to former campers about it. And for me, as a millennial, as I was writing this book, Me Too happened. This book was my dissertation, and then it was a book, so it's been, a very long time of writing. And millennials and Gen Zers, young Jews today, have been talking very, very openly about how this culture of permissiveness at camp had a very dark side as well, that it led to sexual harassment, to a lot of peer pressure. So things are kind of coming around another way, where the younger generation seems to be more clued into why they were allowed to do what they were allowed to do at camp sexually, and not everyone has kind of good feelings about that.
I want to switch topics for a second, what struck me about both of your books is these are putting Jews in agrarian, naturalistic settings. And some of my reporting, if you remember the case of Christian Cooper, the black bird watcher who was harassed, one of the conversations that came about that is that black people in outdoor spaces are seen as they don't belong there. And I think there's a parallel with Jews, right? That Jews are not hardy farming stock, we're bookish, and you could even, scholars, but you could even have the negative weaklings, right? And it's something I discuss in Horse Crazy. Sorry, I'm jumping all over, but I have a lot of thoughts about your books. I always thought as a passionate equestrian that horses were not my birthright. They were the birthright of someone waspier, whiter than me. And the truth is actually in Europe before World War II and where they started to be pushed out, but the horse traders were the Jews. And then there were edicts that prevented them from having that business that became, part of the Nazification and pushing Jews out of professions. And so, we have been participants in everything, and we belong everywhere. But I imagine as these people coming from urban settings, how did they wrap their heads around and their bodies around becoming agriculturists?
Well, it's worth noting that very much there was a Jewish philanthropic push dating back to the 1880s and to make Jews farmers. The idea being we're going to prove that Jews aren't just urban dwellers and that they are strong. They can be people of the land, and there was a notion that it was a way to combat anti-Semitism, that by spreading Jews out, they wouldn't be crowded into the cities. So that was very much part of the idealistic notion of why Jewish farming should be encouraged. A lot of those experiments were dismal failures. The colonies, these collective agricultural colonies that were created from the 1880s on, where they failed miserably.
Can you talk a little bit about those? You're
Sure.
Like it's a given. I did not know about collective Jewish agricultural communities.
It was the Jewish Agricultural Society. A guy named Baron Morris de Hirsch was a German-born financier, and he gave a big chunk of his fortune to encouraging agriculture, both in the U.S., Argentina, and beyond. And so they created these colonies. These idealistic young Jews would come to place in Louisiana, somewhere in South Jersey, Utah, all over. They would fail. They had no idea how to farm, malaria. They would pick a place that didn't have enough water, that had the wrong terrain. There were efforts to and this was the subject of another book here, in American Indian Territory in the Dakotas. You had homesteader Jewish farmers, and those were not terribly successful either. So there was this wave, and you could move the story forward to the era I talk about. Small chicken farms worked a little better. They were more self-sustaining. They didn't require the same level of support. So that was something that sort of worked out a little better. But the survivors themselves, it was complete culture shock. They, in many cases, came from big cities. My family was from Lublin in southwest Poland, a city of several 100,000 people. You're plunked down on a farm. It was a city. Vineland was the center. It was a city of like 30,000 people, but very spread out. You're on a farm. You could be 7 miles, as in the case from my family, that they shared a farm, to downtown. You felt you're in the middle of nowhere, and some of the farmers and their wives were like, this is not me. That they're sort of how they defined themselves. They still saw themselves as urbanites, as middle class or better, and to be stuck on a farm tending to chickens, that's what peasants did. And it just was totally counter to their self-perception. And then just the experience itself, which could be so isolating. It was very hard, that idealistic notion of the farm, or even their own notions of, I'm going to be my own boss and the chickens don't care if you speak Yiddish. It was a hard, hard life. And it only got worse as time went on and egg prices fell.
So can you speak about summer camp? I mean, outdoorsy and Jews are not the stereotype, right? We're the indoor kids.
You're right that it's not the stereotype, but there's such a long history of Jews leaving cities for the country in the summertime. I mean, that happened in Eastern Europe. That was happening in the early 20th century, where Jews were leaving New York City to go upstate, and continue through the mid-century to go to like the Borscht Belt, right? So it's probably more the stereotype is about the working of the land, not so much the actually going upstate or going outdoors. And these camps were not, I mean, as camps go, they were not so outdoorsy. Like, these were built, if anyone's been to a summer camp, most of these American sleepaway camps are pretty built up. There are buildings, there are cabins, there are dedicated spaces for different things. So I think that sort of is my answer to that. But it's definitely true that in terms of outdoorsy activities like farming or hiking, these camps were not the best. They weren't really exemplary in those areas. They did have farms, actually, to connect to your book. A huge part of these Jewish summer camps, especially of the Zionist variety and the Yiddish-oriented variety, was having a period of the day that was dedicated to work, to arbeit or avodah, because that was one of the ways of kind of role-playing different aspects of Jewish history, whether that was taking kind of influence from the Zionist pioneers, the Chalutzim, or from socialist worker Jews in Eastern Europe. And one of the things you could do as work at camp was farming, but they never really produced anything. So I think, again, they go outdoors, but are they outdoorsy? Maybe these were not the most outdoorsy camps that you can imagine.
I want to ask each of you, and I think then in about 2 more questions, we'll open it up to questions of the audience. I hope there are a lot, because I could ask a million questions about these books. What was something that most surprised you in your research? Just something you never expected to learn?
I would say, like I alluded to at the start, the range of experience. I think in my own notions of what Holocaust survivors were like, the range, and I could just pick out like religious observance. There were stories in the local newspaper, which happened to be a Jewish-owned and covered the survivors, the Vineland Times Journal, with great compassion. And they told the story of one survivor lost his whole family, buried a family Torah in a forest in Europe, undug it after the war, brought it to his farm, and was his biggest thing that he wanted to do was hold high holiday service on his farm. And so he had a few farmers within walking distance, and people from his community in Europe who lived near Baltimore came. And just the idea of that you've lost everything, and yet you hold on to that. Now, not everyone was that way. It varied greatly. Some people just gave up on faith, but the range of experience, and something that I think the Yiddish culture, no matter what their religious observance, how they held to that, and those performers I mentioned, and the cultural events, it was to an extent the glue of this community of survivors. So,
I think what surprised me most, as a former camper myself and having heard so much about Jewish summer camps throughout my life, I always suspected that they had these really serious missions and that camp leaders had all sorts of ideas of what their camps would achieve. But really striking for me was moments in my research, being in the archives and just seeing how much ideological clarity and how completely not shy leaders were about it. So like you asked about trauma. One line that stuck out to me, and it's also part of the chapter title for the book, for the chapter about Tisha B'Av and another camp day called Ghetto Day at a camp called Camp Hemshech, was a line that was, "A little suffering goes a long way."
Yeah.
And that was referencing the idea that like you should make your campers suffer a little bit on Tisha B'Av so they understand the suffering of Jews in history. Or at Camp Hemshech, above the stage, there was a banner that said "Milchogen dem Geist was Mahatons vertreut," which means we carry the spirit that's been entrusted to us, right? Like from the Holocaust, or like the Holocaust, we carry that spirit because those people are dead. Just the very seriousness that I could find in those little bits, those quotes where I could not believe what I was reading, because I never thought I would find something so explicit. Like I thought I would have to interpret events more, but they gave it to me. And I think that was what was striking, because I don't think campers necessarily knew how kind of clear their leaders were about what they were doing.
If I could just add, reading your book this week, just the thought that you would need the survivors' children. You don't need Ghetto Day. You didn't need the Tisha B'Av celebration. You certainly didn't need like a play chicken farm. It was just interesting, the elements of camp that that was part of their experience. It just showed to me how much of an outlier to some extent. Although some of them did go to summer camp, and I remember one who I quote in the book, a survivor's son, who said until summer camp he just assumed everyone's parents were survivors. That was the first time he left this bubble, and it was like, wow, because his counselors were so concerned about how he would experience the commemoration. And he thought, well, I thought everyone had this experience.
It's so interesting because, the camp that I studied that was founded by Holocaust survivors, for those kids, the children of survivors, in a lot of cases, that was a place where they got to be around other kids who were survivors. So I guess it depends where you grew up. But for a lot of the alumni I spoke to, they said it was such a relief to be around other people whose parents were survivors. And their experience of Ghetto Day, this day of kind of memorializing the Holocaust, some of them, of course, it might have been familiar, but others, for little kids, that was the first time they really understood what their parents went through and how heavy that actually was. Yeah.
I want to ask the same question of our special guests in the audience, because we have the cover stars, these two little darlings. So they're prepared. I'm going to give them both mic. Will you introduce yourself, and then what surprised you most about Seth's book, and about maybe even about this experience on the farm rather than the book, because you lived the book.
Okay, I'm Seth's mother, and next to me is a very close friend also who I grew up with. Her name is Irene Stern, so she's from Violin too. And this is Dorothy, who is on the cover. She's a blonde one. I think for me, the book is very moving. First of all, the effort and years that Seth put into the research. You went back to Poland. And what touches me the most is how little my mother told me about her experience. And it meant so much to me that she spoke to Seth. Somehow she was comfortable. She was older. And as the survivors aged, it was very important for them to have their stories be told and their legacies to go on. And that's what Seth did with my mother. And that was so meaningful to me because I learned from him things that she never told me. And Dorothy and I were raised, if anyone read the book, we were raised as sisters, as twins, basically, until the age of 6, I believe. Our parents bought a joint farm together, which is very unusual. Our mothers grew up in Lublin together as best friends. Since kindergarten, our mothers were friends. They were separated during the war, but got back together afterwards, came to the country together on the same boat, and we wound up on the farm together. Go ahead. Dorothy?
What surprised you most about that experience of growing up on the farm?
I remained on the farm with. I'm sorry. I remained on the farm. When we were about 6, our parents divided, and they bought a new farm the other side of Vineland. So they were in the Jewish part of Vineland, whereas I was in the more the Italian section, and I experienced anti-Semitism there in that respect. So my experience growing up after we were together was very different than what Ruth had. But and our mothers were very connected, and we used to go to them all the time, and they would come to us all the time. But I had a completely different experience growing up on the farm. And the farm, it was good while it was good, and then when it wasn't, it was terrible. So it was very hard. But a lot of the survivors were able to make it and just continued and became successful. I mean, to me, one of the biggest successes was Miles Lehrman, who was the head of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. So, I mean, to me, that's the epitome. And Seth spoke to many of the children, and he got a tremendous amount of information. And my children and my grandchildren have all read the book and have just appreciated having this information that he was able to accumulate and get.
So I think you speak to I guess my final question, or maybe it's a comment. I hate to be one of those people. Question, not a comment, but I when they're in the audience, I scowl at them, but I'm going to do it. It sounded to me that what these two places had in common was sanctuary, that they offered sanctuary, at least in your case for a time. And you speak in the postscript to people trying to find that again, Jewish farmers. In what ways were these places, it is a question, good, phew. In what ways were these places sanctuary, and in what ways were they not?
I think that they were sanctuary in the sense that it was a place where Jewish kids, most of these kids went to public school, right? So this was a place where they could just be around fellow Jews. And I think that was very relaxing and allowed, when I spoke to former campers, there's so many emotions attached to the camp experience for them. I tried to find campers who also hated camp. I tried to talk to people who didn't like camp because I think that's important to hear about too. But for the most part, when you find alumni, they're usually the enthusiastic types. And so I think for them, it could serve as a sanctuary for that. I also think that for kids just in general, putting Judaism aside, camp can be a sanctuary from whatever difficulty is going on at home, parents going through divorce or problems at school. And I think that's another reason that camp takes on this really emotional significance to people. Yeah.
And were there ways in which it wasn't?
Sure. I wish there was more of this in the book because, again, it's hard to find the people who didn't like the camp experience. But for some kids, camp was awful, right? Kids were bullied, and those sexual experience were not always positive. Or there were campers I spoke to who said, I never had a boyfriend or girlfriend, and then I felt really isolated for that reason. These are camps that served kids and teenagers, and we know that childhood and youth has all of those moments that don't feel good. And so if you didn't like camp and you were stuck there for 4 to 8 weeks, or you were homesick or whatever, then that's not really a sanctuary.
Did you speak to campers, and pardon me if I didn't find this in the book, that rejected the Jewish inculcation, the undertones?
I really wanted to, but finding those people, because if I'm looking for alumni, how do I find them? I mostly can only find them through alumni groups, and the people who join those groups tend to be very saccharine about they liked camp.
Yeah.
I did, however, make a special effort to find campers who later came out of the closet as gay or lesbian, which that was possible. Almost no one, I think no one I found either was out at the time or knew anyone who was out of the closet at the time. And the time span of the book is 1945 through the 1970s. And for them, camp could have been a sanctuary on some levels. And on another level, it was a place where they were, in the closet. They were also in the closet at school, but perhaps all of that kind of intense hetero-romantic environment would make them feel maybe worse or more confused about their sexuality at that time. So definitely it was more complicated for some campers. So.
And ways in which could it be very granular and specific, ways in which these were sanctuaries and ways in which they really weren't?
Yeah, I mean, it was a sanctuary in the sense that you had this universe of survivors. You didn't have to explain why you didn't have grandparents. You didn't have to explain what the tattoo of numbers or letters on your arm was. Just things that were unsaid. They didn't need to be said. And there was also a space and a buffer. If you were a survivor who settled in New York and you were in an apartment in the Bronx or Manhattan, you had no physical space to yourselves. If you had a farm like my family, it was 10 acres. Granted, you shared it with 3,000 hens, but you had much more space than you would as a urban survivor. So in a sense, that was a buffer. You had your own zone. So there were ways that it was unique to rural survivors who were in this setting, that they had that comfort that even in a cluster in Brooklyn or Queens or one of the boroughs that you wouldn't have had.
In ways in which they weren't?
Yeah, one important, and there were certainly instances of anti-Semitism. There were also instances of great generosity by the non-Jewish immigrant community. But what I think of most is they wanted certainty. Understandably, you had this terrible trauma. I think after the war, part of the appeal, you wanted quiet, a nice rural life. Agriculture, by its nature, you were completely at the whims of the markets that are set. Commodities markets far away are setting egg prices. The weather. Chickens are getting sick, and you could wipe out a flock. A brooder stove might burn down your coop. Wild dogs might come and eat your chickens in the middle of the night. So you had so little control, and a lot of the survivors found that very difficult to deal with because they did want to feel a sense of control in their life that you couldn't as a farmer.
In my book, Horse Crazy, my father, he hid in plain sight with a false baptismal certificate with his mother and sister after his father was murdered. And at the very end of the war, he was impressed into essentially enslaved labor on a Polish farm. The people believed that they were harboring Polish refugees, didn't realize they were giving safe haven to Jewish refugees from the war. And when the war ended, that's where my father was, and he hitched a horse that was an untrained horse to a cart, and it had a very hard time pulling them to freedom, his father, his sister and mother. And when he would come to the stables with me and he would smell the poop, he would feel a deep sense of freedom because that was the smell of liberation. And actually on 59th Street, even walking among the carriages. And so, horses were always my sanctuary, but in a small way. They were my father's. And I think you can find sanctuary in fascinating places. I find it in this room. So thank you, of some applause, and then we'll take some questions. Thank you. Sure. How do we do this with this mic? Is there a moderator? Do you want to just yell? Yeah. So we'll go back to front. So you. Oh my God. You. And then we'll take a breath and we'll decide again. Yes.
Okay, well, two quick things. First, somebody mentioned about the ghetto day. I don't think that the kids after the Holocaust who went to these camps were all that traumatized because they probably lived that at home. In some ways, it was probably very familiar. And the other thing is, you mentioned that we are not people of the land. In Europe, you probably couldn't be the people of the land because in most countries, Jews were not allowed to own land.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
they never had a chance to be on a farm and work it. It was just not possible.
Great comments. Well, we have so many people lined up. You were next?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Just to comment on that, my father, who's a survivor, as well as my mother, my father was an outfit. Before the war, my father's family were taking care of orchards, so they were on the land. My father was a contractor.
Interesting.
No,
Yeah.
There you go.
Interesting.
but they worked it.
Wow.
My father survived by building the kitchens in Auschwitz.
Wow.
Okay, so he was a contractor. But you talk about going back to ghetto day, and I'm first generation.
I'm going to use moderator privilege and tell a story quickly. I have the mic. My dad also kept quiet. He ended up writing a book called The Lost Childhood about his experience. And it took until he was in his late 40s. He was at a dinner party in Connecticut, invited by a very nice waspy lady who said, "Don't worry, I also invited someone you can talk to." Of course, the only other Jew, of course. And they sat down, and they got a very posh British accent. And my father recognized underneath the British accent a little something else. And he said, "Where are you from originally?" He said Poland. And he had been put on the Kindertransport and taken to British. They said, "Well, what town?" And they're chatting at this posh dinner. And he said, "Dad, same town as you, Lvov." My dad said, "What?" And then he said, "Kuba, is that you?" And it was his kindergarten Hebrew school classmate, Kuba, and he remembered. And that night, and his name by the end was Jack Mauser, totally different, and they realized they were probably the only survivors from the school. And that night, my dad went into a fugue state and wrote the beginning of what would be. And he became a huge Holocaust scholar after that, traveling around the world talking about his book. But he never spoke about it until he found Kuba in Connecticut. Okay, you, and then you.
For Seth Stern, thank you. How did it happen? So you had people surviving, they come to the United States, did somebody put a big sign, come farm chickens? How did it all come together?
The Jewish Agricultural Society, which I mentioned was the philanthropists' idea, they would put out, they had ads, and that's what my grandfather and Dorothy's father, they saw in the Yiddish paper probably. I couldn't nail down exactly which issue that essentially did that. Hey, you want to be a farmer? What they would offer is a second mortgage, so you needed to piece together the financing. They weren't just handing out checks. So you would take out a mortgage, they would help you secure it, but then you were paying it back and usually were underwater by the end. But it was mostly word of mouth, where one survivor told another, maybe someone you knew back from Europe, or you met at the displaced persons camp, or you met in New York or Detroit, and it was always very... I quote one survivor in a Shoah interview who said they were in Detroit and they heard it was as if the chickens were laying, gold. It was like that gold. The same with the streets are paved with gold. It was like the chickens were laying golden bullion. It was completely unrealistic about what they would be like, but that was the word of mouth, and that's how it got around.
It occurs to me that both the summer camp experience and the experience of survivors or survivors' children in Vineland and Roosevelt, New Jersey, were both second stage post-Holocaust experiences. With the first stage, for most of them, if not all of them, having been BP camps, which went on for most of them for 4 or 5 years. And what struck me in my own research about the BP camps is the degree to which these people articulated a motive that I think may have contributed to their second stage experience, and that is they took on, in some ways, an impossible task. They had seen their families murdered, and they took on the task of recreating their families, and in so doing, recreating their communities. Literally, you can't do that. But emotionally and I think ideologically, you can. And they did. In 4 years in the DP camps and in subsequent experience. And I think it may help to connect the dots about how they came up with these particular ideological and experiential, family-connected, economic life-connected structures that manifested themselves in that second stage.
Beautiful. So we'll start in the back now. So we'll do you. So everyone in the back who wants to talk.
Can I just make a comment?
Yes.
Just in terms of the DP camps, in terms of the DP camps, our parents did not spend 4 years, 3, 4 years. They just went. It was on their way toward the ship where they knew they were going to go, and their town was completely destroyed. And then they had to make the journey, and they went by train as well as they could to the DP camp that got them the papers and able to get them signed and to get on the ships to go. So it wasn't a place where they had to. And some of the larger DP camps had people staying there for many, many years, like you said, but not everyone.
Okay, so we'll do blue, and then very back row, then you, and then red stripey, and then we'll revisit.
I know of 2 camps that catered to children of survivors, Hemshik and Boulder.
Yep.
How did they differ from other?
Great question. Those camps are really they're at the center of the book, actually. And I could have written a whole book just about Hemshech and Boybrik, but I thought it was more interesting actually to look at them and compare them to other Jewish summer camps. I think the biggest difference is that in this creating of an ideal Jewish lifestyle within the summer camp, Zionist camps would use Israel as its kind of inspiration. Camp Ramah, the Reform summer camps, other kinds of like mainline Jewish educational summer camps would also borrow from Israel, but they would also obviously borrow from Jewish rituals, from tradition, from the Torah. The Yiddish summer camps were so different in that they particularly Boybrik and Hemshech, in that they really focused on the Yiddish-speaking past in Eastern Europe. I mean, you could think that in reaction to the Holocaust, they would want to not focus on the lives that had been lived before. They might take the tact of most American Jews and sort of ignore the history of Jews in Europe and focus on Israel. But actually, they didn't do that. They very much did the opposite. And so that made them, in some ways, what was, like, going back to that question of what was surprising about the book, one thing that's surprising about the research I did is how similar these summer camps were in terms of the order of their schedules, what they contained, but what they drew inspiration from was so different. And Hemshech and Boybrik kind of work as the perfect foils to the rest of the American Jewish camping experience. So it's a great question.
I'm going to be a terribly...
Yes, they are.
I'm going to be a terribly cruel moderator, but I just saw the time is getting crazy. So we're only going to do 2 more questions of the people. No, not you. Sorry. Of the people that I already said. So the next 2 can go. Sorry, Stripey, you're out. But you can talk to these people and each other because this is freaking awesome. So the 2 others, and then that's it. That was you, yeah. Can you speak a little louder?
Louder.
Secondary sources.
Yes, of course. Yeah, that was the Brandis, right? Oh, wow. Oh, I know. I was so sorry I didn't get a chance to connect with him. So he wrote a story of the Jewish farming communities of South Jersey. His focus really was the earlier phases. So the post-war was just really a few pages at the end. But yeah, to understand what had happened before, that book was so central. So it's so nice that you're here.
No, I mean, I think that is a great question. I mean, in general, the voices of parents don't really come through in the archives because the parents send the kids away. The only time I got a glimpse of what parents were thinking is if the parents wrote a letter to the camp and then the camp decided to archive that letter. So usually that was a disgruntled parent, like, why is my kid unhappy, you know, and then I suppose the director probably replied, and that reply is not in the archive. So no, they definitely weren't reticent to send them away. I think they felt very safe about the fact that these were ran by Jewish institutions. Usually in that period, these summer camps were ran by organizations that those parents were members of. So if you were part of the Arbeiterring, you would send your kid to Kindering, right? If you were part of Hadassah, you'd send your kids to a Young Judea camp when Young Judea and Hadassah became, related. So I think they felt very safe with that, actually. That's a great question. And parents in general just don't get a lot of attention in the book because they're just not really in the archives.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please ask your questions and buy these books. They're fascinating.